This is episode 102 of the Magic Detective Podcast. On this episode, you'll hear about the life of George Newmann, Pioneer Mentalist. That and more on this episode of the Magic Detective Podcast. Hello and welcome to the Magic Detective Podcast, your podcast home for magic history. I'm your host, Dean Carnegie. I am the Magic Detective, and this is episode 102. Back again and excited as ever to share more magic history with you. This episode, I explore more about the world of mentalists and mentalism. I have a number of episodes on mentalists, which include episode 15 on 3 of the pioneers of mind reading, episode 21 on the Zanzigs, episode 30 on Samuel Baldwin, episode 38 Theodore Anneman, episode 74 Anna Eva Faye, episode 94, Maurice Fogel, episode 99 on the young Joe Dunninger. And now, today, episode 102. And there will be more in future podcasts as well on mentalists. I've not covered, for example, Alexander, the Man Who Knows. I've not covered Bob Cassidy, Max Maven, David Burglas, and many of the two-person acts in the history of magic. So there's a lot of more mind-reading episodes to come. And actually, there are so many big names in magic that I haven't covered yet, to think of it. And I've done that on purpose. I kind of like the variety each season rather than starting with, doing the most famous people that everybody's heard about. I include some of the famous people, but I try to include some lesser knowns as well. And personally, I learn a lot along the way about some of these performers that you've heard their names maybe, but you don't know much about them. So I think it's a better way to go. And now that I've done 101 episodes, this being 102, there are many more episodes yet to come. And I figured it out the other day. There's at least somewhere between 5 and 10 more years of podcasts, and it may go on beyond that. In fact, at some point, I may have to find somebody else to take over the podcast. But for now, you're stuck with me. All right. So today's episode deals with a fellow who honestly, he must be begging from the spirit world to be on the podcast. And why do I say that? Well, back in February at the Magic History Conference in Orlando, Florida, I took some photos of some vintage magic posters, and I didn't even realize until just last week that several of them were Newmann posters. And then there was the fact that Newmann's name would pop up time and again while doing research on other people. I was researching, for example, contact mind reading, and it turns out that Newmann wrote the introduction to the book by Daryl Fitzke. Last month's episode on Ramses had me going through tons of magazines, and several times Newmann's name again would either appear on the cover or he would have an article about him within the magazine I was looking at. So he has popped up so many times, I guess he's just been in my subconscious. So for the record, he was not really a national act. He was he had a very specific territory, the Northwest region of the United States. Yet he has left a lasting impression on the world of magic because one of the reasons he was kind of fraternal. I think to some degree, he didn't like the organizations, but on another hand, he liked his fellow magicians. And we'll find out more about that as we go along. And now, if I might steal a line from a famous comedy show, hello, Newman. He was born Christian Andrew George Naiseth on November 28th, 1880, in or near Kenyon, Minnesota. He had 2 brothers, Marius and Chester, as well as a sister named Gunda. The one brother, Marius, actually worked in the Newmann show for a period of time. And where does a young Minnesotan discover magic? In the case of George, it came about from seeing a man named Harry Heller, the man of mystery. Here was a showman who stole the name of 2 of the most popular magicians of the time, Harry Keller and Robert Heller. And according to the book, The Great Newman Show by James Albertson, the man's real name was Bruno Warnecke, and he was one of many tall grass showman of the day. But he must have been good enough to inspire a young George Naiseth, who would soon go on to find magic books of his own and begin his journey into the strange world of magic. It would seem George was exposed to a large group of hypnotists as well as mentalists, including John Randall Brown, Herbert Flint, Professor William Bennett, and Paul Alexander Johnstone. And it was Johnstone who would display his signature routine, the blindfold drive. Imagine a number of performers who have done this very feat, yet it was Johnstone who was the originator. Of course, the modern-day performers did the blindfold drive using an automobile, for example. Johnstone did his with a horse and carriage. And as I said, it would leave a lasting impression on young George. John Randall Brown was also kind of a Minnesotan. He was originally from St. Louis. He retired to Minnesota and is buried there. Brown developed a unique form of mind reading that many of the early mentalists adopted, including Washington Irving Bishop, Stuart Cumberland, Paul Alexander Johnstone, and more. And this unusual technique developed by Brown would become the cornerstone of young George Naiseth's future act. But before we get there, as a teenager, George would visit his aunt in St. Paul, Minnesota. And while he was on vacation, Alexander Herman came to town. And in attendance at those performances was George, who even took it upon himself to go backstage and meet the great Herman. The great Newman show biography says that according to his brother Chester, it was after seeing Alexander Herman that George decided to change his last name from Naiseth to Newman, a name which sounded vaguely familiar to Herman. In 1895, he would embark on his first shows as Newman the Boy Wonder. He added a stunt he used for publicity that featured the technique developed by John Randall Brown. But it should be noted that Newman's version came more from a child's game of the time called Will It. He also took his version further than anyone had before or since. His technique became non-contact mind reading, and the secrets of his technique went to the grave with Newman. In his days as Newman the Boy Wonder, his shows consisted of 3 parts: magic, hypnosis, and mentalism or mind reading. His career began at the tender age of 15, performing in the Northwest region of the United States, and according to David Price's book, Magic, A Pictorial History on Conjurers in the Theater, we have this quote from Newman. Magic was a staple part of my program when I was a boy wonder, but on discovering that mental demonstrations were my forte, I discarded magic completely, and for over 30 years, I made an enviable reputation as a stage hypnotist and mind reader, unquote. But he also found that on this particular circuit, he would have repeat dates, places he'd been before, places that had already seen his show. So he needed to offer them something different. And along comes his friend, Claude Conlon, known better as Alexander the Man Who Knows. And Alexander told him to bring back some of the magic. So this time, he revamped some of the effects so it would tie in with either mental demonstrations or hypnotic demonstrations. To drum up publicity, he would include a feat that he had seen Paul Alexander Johnstone and John Randall Brown perform, the blindfold drive. In his version, he would be blindfolded and placed in a horse-drawn carriage. He would then take the reins and drive the horses and carriage along a designated route. The stunt did wonders for publicity and usually helped to fill in all of the seats. There are even posters that remain today of Newman's blindfold drive. Of course, any demonstration of blindfold driving is strange for a spectator, for here is a driver, either blindfolded or has their entire head covered with a hood, yet they are perfectly able to steer the vehicle wherever it's needed. George Newman also shifted away from the more flamboyant approach to mentalism that was popular with folks like Samuel Baldwin and Alexander the Man Who Knows. In Newman's case, no turbans, no elaborate costumes. Instead, he wore fine evening clothes and presented it in almost a scientific approach to his performances. And though he took on a somewhat serious approach, his stage shows still were filled with laughter and comedy. Now, Newman was also a hypnotist, and hypnotists of the time were known to use what were called horses. Now, this is not the four-legged animal. In fact, pretty much all hypnotists did this back then, except for Newman. Horses was an insider term for paid stooge or accomplice. In other words, the so-called volunteers on the stage were actually paid to do what they were doing. And Newman figured out a way how to actually hypnotize the people without needing to use stooges. Genuine members of the audience could come up and be brought up on stage and be used in the act. And this would completely change the hypnosis industry drastically, as everyone eventually would follow Newman's approach and dump the age-old horses. But this also assured that Newman would be able to return year after year, because often in the fake hypnosis shows, people would find out later that some or all of the spectators on stage were stooges. In Newman's case, they were all real town folk who everybody in the town knew, so it made it that much more authentic. Here's an article from the Mayville Tribune, June 14th, 1928, in North Dakota, quote, "By reason of the fact that Mr. Newman has been playing the better towns of this state for some 32 years, he is so well known here that any comment regarding his attraction is superfluous. We merely take time to remark that Mr. Newman's remarkable performance has never been equaled by any performer in this class that we have yet seen. This fact is so well established here that his advent among us in any event we always look forward to it by all lovers of clean entertainment. Mystifying and unusual as it is. The majority of the community are glad to see him whenever he appears and equally sorry to see him leave." Unquote. Newman performed in this area of the country continuously for, I have here 46 years, but it's actually closer to 52 or 53 years. Unlike some of the areas of the country where theaters would close during the summer months, Newman thrived during the summer in this part of the country. It was winter that saw him vacationing. From a Linking Ring article in 1933, we find this little bit of information. It seems that Newman was vacationing in Los Angeles during the winter months, and he had the good fortune to be hired to perform at a function for Hollywood actress Marion Davies. She was the mistress to William Randolph Hearst and also romantically connected to Charlie Chaplin for a time. The event was Davies' father's birthday, and several acts were hired: the great Leon, Nellar and Hoffman, and George Newman. And according to the article, Newman's no-contact mind reading was the hit of the evening, so much so that Davies took Newman aside and offered him the deal of the century. She wanted him to appear professionally for future exclusive social affairs in Hollywood, and she added he could name his fee, as the fee there would be no objection. Whatever he asked, they were willing to pay. As a side note to his time in Hollywood, during one of his visits, an earthquake struck the area, and though shaken up, he was not injured. Over time, the old Opry houses in the Northwest were torn down and made into other businesses, so to accommodate the audiences, Newman traveled for a time with his own tent. And though this could be problematic at times, Newman's tent shows thrived. That is until 1940, when he began to have health issues and put his tent show up for sale. And despite no tent, Newman eventually continued to perform and did so for another 12 years. In 1941, after World War II broke out, Newman added a motion picture show to his touring production. And this was essentially a newsreel, which was video footage of news of the day, essentially, because there was no CNN or cable news or anything like that. So for people to see the news, they had to go to a movie theater. And these newsreels showed authentic footage from the war fronts. Newman wrote an interesting article in Genie magazine called Spooks Go to Church. And in his article, he put forth an interesting and maybe somewhat controversial point of view towards spirit mediums. He said, quote, "I have always contended that publicity-seeking magicians who challenge and attempt to expose mediums actually debase magic and actually boost the medium's game," unquote. Then he went on to share an event that took place at the Wesley Church in Minneapolis. A so-called dean of Emerson College from Boston put on the demonstration. He first began with the spiritualist show, giving a history of spiritualism and demonstrating a number of mysterious feats. As Newman was quite the authority on the topic, he instantly recognized all of the conjuring feats dressed as spirit phenomenon. The show itself was great, but it was the exposure that fell apart. Much of the phenomenon in the show couldn't be exposed because they were store-bought magic. And the ones that were exposed were sort of older methods of the mediums that everyone already knew. It was a successful night in regards to a full house at 50 cents per person, but it didn't do much to get the message across. And this manner of thinking would take on a new form a few years later when mentalism began to grow ever popular. And among the mental performers, there were some who could be called clairvoyant hustlers. Many magicians, ignorant of the fact that mentalists were true brothers of the art, began to expose these mental magicians. And I think they really wanted to tamp down on the hustlers, but they included everyone in the process. And Newman took issue with this, but it never once harmed his business. After all, he was essentially the epitome of an honest magical artist. He did not swindle his audiences in any way, which allowed him to return again and again, year after year, to his performing territory. August 1935, the Linking Ring put Newman on the cover of their magazine. And we learned that at one time, Howard Thurston sat with Newman for a 4-hour session, at the conclusion of which Thurston was said to proclaim that, quote, "Newman was the greatest of all mentalists. Thurston regarded Newman as the most remarkable man he has ever met in the field of magic." No small praise there. Then there was John Northern Hilliard, who was equally blown away by Newman's artistry and abilities. In the Baghdad column of Genie magazine, May 1937, there's a brief mention of Newman sending an advertising piece to Genie magazine. They mention the advertising piece is written all in Norwegian, which they cannot read. But this is actually brilliant. You see, the upper part of the United States, Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, and beyond, were filled with folks of Norwegian descent, or who had just immigrated from Norway. What a smart way to cater to these folks by printing ads in their native language. Also, George's ancestors came from Norway, and likely there were older members of the family who could still speak and spell the language. Speaking of advertising, Newman was clever and sometimes even ruthless in his use of advertising pieces. Maybe ruthless is too strong a word. Maybe stingy or cheap would be better suited. Sometimes he copied other performers' pieces. Sometimes he even used their pieces and simply added his name to the top. Now, I know he was friends with Claude Conlon, known as Alexander, the Man Who Knows, but it appears that Newman even borrowed, we'll use that word, borrowed from him. On one poster, he calls himself a crystal seer and uses a question mark wrapped around his head in a similar way that Alexander used the turban shape as a question mark in some of his advertising. In Newman's case, the question mark is made up of the following words: "Ask him, he knows." And in later advertisements, he even is shown with his profile and the Alexander question mark turban over his head. One thing that set Newman apart from his contemporaries, he was a collector of books. And by the 1930s, he had acquired some 7,000 volumes on magic and the related arts. He was a true student of his craft. In 1939, he notified the magic community that he would be selling off his books, and whether or not he sold them in question, well, it comes up in 1943 that the Linking Ring did a several-page spread on his collection. So in 39 to 43, I'm not sure he sold anything. Newman had rented a commercial store in order to display all his books, and they were broken into several categories. And along the walls and any spare space in the shop were small posters and window cards from Newman and other performers. As exciting as it sounds, there were some in the magic community that questioned Newman's collection. Did he really have 7,000 volumes? Were they truly all just magic or what? And there were other collectors in the country who had themselves huge volumes of books on magic. And these various collectors, they let a feud break out in the pages of the Topps magazine as well as other places. Newman would often become enraged about the whole thing. His collection, to him, was sort of a badge of honor. Yet, to see someone else with a smaller collection be called the authority on mentalism really got under his skin. Over time, Newman would list parts of his collection, and he would list some amazing volumes. And yet, when some of the better-known collectors would call to inquire about purchasing them, Newman was known to say, sorry, that book just sold, and the new owner has asked that I keep his identity a secret. Did he really sell the books, or was this just a clever way of getting even at some of his adversaries? In addition, during this period of feuding, a darker side of Newman emerged. It seems he kept it away from his audiences, but in his private letters, sadly, he would often throw out many anti-Semitic insults. This sort of behavior, frankly, infuriates me, and it casts a dark cloud over what was otherwise an amazing career. Newman continued to perform up until 1952. In August of that year, he was diagnosed with cancer of the gallbladder. Surgery was planned, but it was discovered that the cancer had spread to other organs as well. His final days were spent in a hospital where he remained in extreme pain and most of the time was doped up to help with the struggle. George Newman died December 30th, 1952. And you might think that's the end of the story, but according to David Price's book, Magic, A Pictorial History of Conjurers in the Theater, we have this, quote, in accordance with his wishes, Newman's body was cremated, but it wasn't until September 15th, 1953, that his brother and two friends completed his request by taking the box that contained his ashes and consigned them to the mighty Mississippi River, unquote. However, I discovered a family plot for the Naiseth family, which is located in the Lakewood Cemetery in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And George is listed among those buried there. However, I can find no photos of his actual grave. That's not uncommon on this particular site, find a grave, but I just don't have any photos of it. There is a photo of a sibling who died at 2 years of age, but there's no photo of George Newman's grave. So maybe he has a grave plot there, but he was never buried there because, as I mentioned, his ashes were scattered, or maybe the ash story is false and he truly was buried in Lakewood Cemetery. If he is, then he's a neighbor of numerous of my relatives who were also buried in Lakewood Cemetery in Minneapolis. And that, my friends, is the life story of George Newman, Pioneer Mentalist. And please do me a favor. If you can, if there's a way on whatever podcasting provider you're listening to, if there's a way to like this story, please do that. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please consider giving me a 5-star review. I'd like to bump up the numbers of reviews as well as likes on this particular podcast. So if you could do that, I would really appreciate it. Until next time, I'm Dean Carnegie. I am the Magic Detective. Thanks for listening. Please be well and stay safe.